Hey, this is the man Votional. I'm about to read out our highlight scripture. It is Galatians chapter 6, verse 2, and it reads as the following: Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. See, this is the man Votional, and I'm glad that you're here because I'm here for you. Let me give you some cultural context. But before that, let me make sure I give y'all some props, because guess what? Our husbands have been moving in the journey of developing as men, and this time we have decided to bring our wives along, or to include our wives in that process. So our men have been leading the devotionals and leading their families into sanctity. So if you're a wife and you happen to be listening to this with your husband, with your man, with your king, you make sure you get that man props. All right, with that being said, let me give you some cultural context. The Galatians was oftentimes they was battling. Paul was talking to the Galatians, and they was dealing with a lot of legalism as well as a lot of other things. But legalism was taking place because they said, hey man, the new people who've joined the congregation, they also need to be go through the process of circumcision. And Paul was bringing correction, because he said, yeah, they need to go through the process of circumcision, but it's the spiritual process of circumcision, meaning what circumcision was really pointing to was a spiritual component, meaning you need to cut off the flesh, the old man, cut off the carnality of the old man, and walk in the newness. And Paul was saying, that's what I want y'all to think about, is the spiritual circumcision. He said, when you're walking with a guy who's dealing with carnality, or cutting away this old way of thinking, you need to be gentle in your approach, because whenever you correct a brother, you also need to understand that you can fall victim to that very sin that you're correcting him on. You don't want to be too haughty in the process when you're dealing with another brother, but you also want to understand that you have your own obligation, your own cross to bear. So when you speak to a brother, you need to keep that in mind. This works perfect in marriage, because as a believer, as a marriage unit, we know that we all have been given our own cross to bear. But as you walk in your marriage, you realize that marriage has a unique burden to bear as well, because you're dealing, or you operating with another person that you are responsible for to a high degree. So the parallels make sense. The devotional asks 3 questions that we're going to be expanding on, and I'm going to tell you how to bear one another's burdens in these particular questions. It says, the devotional asks us to rate ourselves on a scale of 1 through 5 through how do we bear one another's burdens when we going through conflict. How do we bear one another's burdens when we're dealing with honesty? And how do we bear one another's burdens when we think of being a step ahead? That's a question that we pose. Now, when you think about bearing one another's burdens, Christ says this is a fulfillment of the law, because the law, the royal law, is to love your neighbor as you love yourself. So he says, when you bearing a brother's burdens, you are operating in love. When you bear your wife's, your spouse's burdens, this is the operation of love. You can fulfill the law by loving your spouse. But in order to love your spouse, you have to be able to bear one another's burdens. So how does this happen? It says, going through conflict. He says, so when you're going through conflict, what does it look like to bear one another's burdens? It's like this. When your spouse has a problem, you have a problem. When your spouse has a problem, you have a problem. In other words, I can't just look at my spouse and say, well, that's what she's going through, or that's what they got going on. And if they bother by that, that's what they do. I have to say, well, how can I share in this? How can I have empathy? How can I put myself in their circumstance? And this is why you have to relate to them through your own situation. Because, say for instance, sometimes it's hard for me to relate to my wife when she's really worrying about something, because that's not something I struggle with. But I can relate to her by looking at the struggles that we have uniquely built for men. and say, well, that's how I can fall victim to the acts of lust, is the same way she can fall victim to the fleshly acts of worrying. So that's how you bear one another's burdens, by having empathy. The other aspect is being honest. How do you bear one another's burdens in honesty? Meaning, I have an obligation to be truthful with my wife, but when I'm truthful, that must be peppered in love. You have an obligation to give your spouse the truth, but it must be in love. Sometimes we give in truth, but it don't have no love, or sometimes we ain't giving no truth at all because we don't want to do no hurt. What happens in marriage is truth typically hurts. That's why you want to give it as gentle as possible. And when you're being honest with a person, you also want to consider how you would take what you want to consider how you would take such news if it was delivered to yourself. Not in the sense of saying I won't give it at all, but in the sense that I have an obligation to give truth, because truth gives my spouse the proper perspective. And when they operate in the proper perspective, they can move in a proper manner. And the last part is being a step ahead. What does it look like to bear my spouse's burdens? Bear burdens, being a step ahead. Well, the first one was about bearing burdens, but when you think about being a step ahead, I want you to think about bearing one another's passions. Okay, so some things that your spouse really has a desire to do that you don't necessarily have a desire to do. So when you bear one another's passions by being a step ahead, it looks like this in my marriage. My wife, she has a passion to eat healthy. So she wants to feed the kids healthy things. So when she can't do it, or when I anticipate that that's what she wants to do, and then I take that on, it's a relief for her. Or I have a passion to make sure my kids are outside and getting sunlight. So when I'm not able to do it, when my wife does it, it relieves my spirit. So these are the things that I want you to rate yourself on a scale 1 through 5. I'm glad you was able to listen, and I'm glad that you've been staying tuned, and give your husband some props. All right, y'all.